Barry and Honey Sherman. In December of 2017, one of the wealthiest couples in Canada was found dead inside their own mansion, seated side by side beside their basement swimming pool. There was no sign that anyone had broken in, nothing had been stolen, and within 2 days the police had quietly settled on a theory that would enrage the family for years to come. Nearly a decade later, no one has been charged, and a reward that now stands in the tens of millions of dollars has gone completely unclaimed. Barry Sherman was 75 years old, a self-made billionaire who had built the generic drug company Apotex from the ground up back in 1974. His wife, Honey, was 70. Together, they were among the best-known philanthropists in the country, lending their name and their fortune to hospitals, universities, and charities across Canada and well beyond it. They were the kind of people whose names sat carved into the walls of the institutions they had helped build. On the morning of December 15, 2017, a real estate agent arrived at the couple's North York home to prepare it for sale. She was expecting an empty property. Instead, in the lower level of the house, beside the indoor lap pool, she found Barry and Honey seated upright, leather belts looped around their necks and fastened to a railing that ran along the edge of the water. They had last been seen alive around the 13th. The cause of death was later ruled to be ligature neck compression. There was no forced entry, no ransacking, and nothing taken. Within 48 hours, unnamed police sources had leaked a theory to the press, one that suggested Barry had taken Honey's life and then his own. To the family, that explanation was not just wrong, it was insulting. They hired a criminal lawyer named Brian Greenspan, who assembled his own private team of former homicide detectives, forensic experts, and a retired pathologist who carried out a second, independent autopsy. What that team found pointed away from a murder-suicide entirely. Honey appeared to have struggled, with small cuts on her lip and nose. And the immediate area where the bodies were found had not even been vacuumed for evidence by the police. The leak, the family believed, had pointed the entire early investigation in the wrong direction and cost precious time it could never get back. So who would want both of them gone? A couple whose generosity had touched half the institutions in the city. About 6 weeks after the discovery, in late January of 2018, the police reversed course and reclassified the deaths as a targeted double homicide. From there, the theories multiplied. Some pointed to the ruthless world of pharmaceutical litigation that Barry had spent his life inside, a business thick with lawsuits and rivals. And court records later revealed that a cousin had lost a legal battle against him worth roughly $1 billion shortly before the killings. The deaths sent a shock through Canadian business and political circles, where Barry had been a towering and sometimes combative figure for decades. Others looked closer to home, at money and family. The relationship between the family and the police grew openly hostile. And at one point, investigators threatened to seek a warrant unless the family handed over items they had gathered themselves, including fibers from the pool room and an earring found in the driveway. In December of 2021, a detective released surveillance footage of a figure the investigators came to call the Walking Man, someone seen strolling near the home around the time the couple was believed to have died. The footage showed the figure moving through the streets on foot, and investigators believed it had captured someone connected to the killings rather than a passerby. That person was formally treated as a suspect, and he has never been identified. For the family, the release came 4 years too late, and it only deepened their long-standing frustration with how the case had been handled from the very first days. As of early 2026, The case remains open and unsolved. Toronto police say they have chased more than 1,200 tips, obtained dozens of warrants, and interviewed at least 250 people. The family's reward, which began at 10 million Canadian dollars, was raised on the 5th anniversary of the deaths by a further 25 million, bringing it to $35 million in total, and it has never been collected. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada ordered the couple's sealed estate files opened. More recent reporting suggests the active investigation has narrowed to a single lead detective, now leaning on data software to sift through years of accumulated evidence. The mansion where it all happened was torn down in 2019. The family has said plainly that there can be no closure until whoever did this is brought to justice. Wealth had not protected the Shermans, and neither had the walls of one of the most exclusive addresses in Toronto. Roughly 1,000 miles to the south, in a gated Georgia community so quiet that neighbors struggled to remember the last crime of any kind. Another older couple was about to learn that a locked gate in a peaceful street can mean nothing at all. Russell and Shirley Dermond. In May of 2014, a retired couple in their late 80s failed to appear at a neighborhood party in one of the safest gated communities in Georgia. When friends went to check on them, they found a scene so strange that the veteran investigators who worked it would call it one of the most bizarre cases of their entire careers. One of them was dead in the garage. The other had vanished and would not be found for another 10 days. Russell Dermond was 88. His wife Shirley was 87. The two had been married for 68 years and lived in the gated Great Waters section of a lakeside resort community about 60 miles southeast of Atlanta. They were the sort of unremarkable, well-liked octogenarians whose corner of the world had not seen so much as a burglary in recent memory. Russell was last seen alive on the 1st of May, running errands in the nearby town of Eatonton, and the couple spoke with their son by phone that same day. When they did not appear at a Kentucky Derby party that weekend and could not be reached, concern began to build. By then, the ordinary rhythm of the couple's life had clearly stopped days before. On the 6th of May, neighbors went to the house and found Russell in the garage. He had been decapitated and his head was missing. Shirley was gone entirely. 10 days later, on the 16th, fishermen out on Lake Oconee discovered her body about 5 miles away, weighed down with 2 concrete blocks and caught in the branches of trees beneath the surface. She had died from blunt force trauma. Whoever was responsible had taken Shirley from the home and carried her to the water, which meant the two of them had been dealt with in entirely different ways, on entirely different nights. The case was led by the local sheriff, Howard Sills, alongside the FBI, whose agent would work it for close to 9 years. Investigators found gunshot residue on Russell's clothing, which suggested he had been shot, and the sheriff came to believe the head had been removed for a cold and practical reason, to make it impossible to recover a bullet and match it to a weapon. Russell's head has never been found. The FBI agent who worked the case said he believed more than one person had to have been involved. The precision of it, the removal of the head, the weighting of a body in a lake, the total absence of witnesses inside a guarded community, all pointed to something planned rather than random. How does a couple in their late 80s, tucked behind a security gate in a place that had never known real crime, become the target of something this deliberate and this coordinated? No one has ever been able to answer that. There was no robbery. Nothing of value was taken. Over the years, the theories ranged from an organized hit to some hidden connection the couple never spoke about. But none of them ever held. The Dermonds had lost their oldest son years earlier, murdered in Atlanta in 2000 during a drug purchase. Yet, investigators concluded there was no link between his death and what happened to his parents. The couple had no enemies anyone could name, no debts, and no secrets that ever surfaced. Even the seasoned agents who worked it described it as one of the strangest cases they had ever encountered. For a long time, the case simply sat, too strange to crack and too quiet to forget. Then, in February of 2024, the sheriff personally carried a piece of evidence, part of Russell's clothing, to a specialized forensics lab in Utah. It was the kind of lab that had cracked other long cold cases using advanced genetic techniques, and the sheriff hoped it might finally give this one a name. Around the 10th anniversary of the killings, the FBI announced something it had never had before. For the first time, investigators had recovered what is known as touch DNA from an unknown person, genetic material that did not belong to either of the Dermans. The sheriff called it the best evidence developed in 10 years, and the profile was submitted to the FBI's National DNA Database in the hope of a match. As of the middle of 2026, no match has been announced. The reward has been raised to around $25,000 in total, with the FBI putting up the larger share and the sheriff's office adding to it. And the case remains open with no named suspect. Their surviving sons have made repeated public appeals over the years, unwilling to let the case fade. A decade on, the family has said the not knowing is the hardest part to live with. The Derman's killer left behind a fragment of DNA but no name to attach to it. A perfect clue pointing nowhere. That same maddening pattern, a wealth of physical evidence and a complete absence of motive, waited more than 2,000 miles to the west, in a hillside neighborhood above Reno, where another retired couple had gone to bed on an ordinary spring night. Albert and Joan Musalo. One spring morning in 2006, a daughter drove up to her parents' home in the hills above Reno because she could not reach them by phone. The doors were locked and the house looked undisturbed from the outside. And yet the moment she stepped inside, she saw mud tracked across the dining room floor. Her husband walked ahead of her into the bedroom, and there he found her mother and father shot to death in their own bed. Nothing had been stolen, and to this day, no one knows who walked through that house or why. Albert Musalo was 75, a retired flight engineer who had spent his career with Pan American Airways. His wife, Joan, also 75, had raised their 4 children at home. Both had grown up in Brooklyn during the Great Depression and had been married for 53 years. Their daughter would later describe Joan as endlessly social and a passionate cook, the kind of woman you could never visit without being handed something to eat. The couple's last confirmed contact was with a furniture salesman around midday on the 27th of March. And a computer inside the home showed someone using the internet late into that night. They had been looking forward to a trip east to see family. The next day, the 28th, their daughter came by after security at the community could get no answer at the door. She let herself into the locked house, saw the mud across the floor, and moments later, her husband discovered Albert and Joan in the bedroom. Some accounts place the killings on the night of the 27th and others on the day they were found. But the discovery is the fixed point everyone agrees on. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office took the case, and what they found only deepened the mystery. The telephone line had been cut from outside the house. A trail of muddy footprints led through the rooms and out the back, toward a hiking trail on the far side of the fence. It suggested the killer had approached and escaped across open ground, avoiding the roads and the front gate entirely. There was no forced entry, and nothing of value had been touched. Investigators did recover physical evidence, including unknown male DNA left on the very phone wire that had been cut, along with ballistics from the scene. The specific firearm used is one detail the police have deliberately kept from the public, confirming only that it was not a shotgun. On paper, the couple was about as low risk as a victim could be. The detectives who caught the case, among them a veteran investigator who would later leave to work it privately, could find nothing in the couple's quiet lives to explain why anyone would want them dead. What kind of person cuts a phone line, crosses a muddy yard in the dark, takes 2 lives, and then leaves without so much as opening a drawer? Police are convinced the couple was targeted, but they have never been able to establish why. What unsettles investigators most is how organized it all was. Cutting the line from outside meant the couple could not call for help, and the muddy footprints suggested the killer moved through the home with purpose and left the same way, on foot, into the open land behind the property. This was not a burglary that turned violent. Whoever did this had come prepared and had come for them specifically. Their own daughter came to believe the most unbearable explanation of all: that someone had simply killed the wrong people. It is a theory born less of evidence than of desperation, an attempt to explain the unexplainable, and the police have never been able to rule it out. The unknown male DNA recovered from the scene was entered into the national database and, as of the most recent reporting, has never matched anyone. The ballistics evidence is waiting too, ready to be tied to a weapon the moment one is ever recovered. For now, it all sits in storage, complete and useless. A full portrait of a killer with no face to match it to. The family continues to offer a reward of $35,000 for information. As of 2026, the Washoe County Sheriff's Office still lists the killings among its unsolved homicides. A targeted, methodical double murder, with a full genetic profile of the killer and still no name to give it. Albert and Joan had been planning to travel east to see the family they loved, a trip they never took. Whoever came to the Musallo home came only to do this, and then disappeared into the desert night. The idea that Albert and Joan Musallo may have died in place of someone else is only a theory, one their daughter has carried for years. Roughly a quarter-century earlier, though, on the other side of the country, investigators built almost their entire case around exactly that possibility. A fire set at the wrong address, and 2 people who died for a grudge that was never theirs. Joseph and Betty Selby. For decades, families in a corner of Maryland brought their children to a fairy tale amusement park run by a man who, by every account, would give almost anyone a job. In March of 1981, that man and his wife came home after an evening out, lay down to rest, and never woke up. Someone had set their house on fire while they slept. And the leading theory, the one the police still hold today, is that the 2 of them were never meant to be the victims at all. Joseph Selby was 56 and managed the Enchanted Forest, a beloved fairy tale-themed park on Route 40 that had been a local landmark for generations. His wife, Betty, was 51, and the 2 had been married for nearly 40 years. Joseph was the kind of figure a small community builds itself around, remembered above all for hiring the people who needed a chance. The park itself would stay open until the mid-90s, long enough for many of the children who once visited it to bring children of their own. On the 6th of March, 1981, the Selbys had drinks with friends at a restaurant on Frederick Road, then headed home to nap before returning for a bluegrass band they wanted to hear. Around 20 minutes to 10 that night, someone set fire to their home. The couple, asleep inside, died of smoke inhalation. Local lore even held that Joseph had once studied under Walt Disney himself out in California. A small detail that says everything about how the community saw the man who ran their fairy tale park. By the time the flames were noticed, it was already too late for anyone inside to be saved. Howard County Police, and years later a dedicated cold case detective, came to believe the fire was an act of revenge that landed on the wrong doorstep. It is a theory the police have held for decades, and the chain of events behind it is almost mundane. About 5 years earlier, the couple's nephew, a young man the family called Johnny, had been stabbed during a bar fight in a nearby town, and the man who attacked him served time in prison. The theory is that once he was released, he went looking for payback. Searching for the family name, he found a mailbox that read J.N. Selby and set fire to that house, never realizing it belonged to the wrong branch of the family, and never realizing, or never caring, that people were asleep inside. The stabbing years earlier had been an ordinary act of small-town violence, the kind that flares up in a bar and ends in a courtroom. But the man who served time for it, police believe, carried the grudge with him through his years behind bars and went hunting for the family that had put him there the moment he was free. Investigators have long noted that the Selbys were, by every measure, innocent bystanders in someone else's feud, two people who happened to share a name and a stretch of road with the man who was actually being pursued. How do you begin to make sense of two people dying for a quarrel that had nothing to do with them, at an address chosen by mistake? That question has hung over the case for more than 40 years. The family eventually gave that very mailbox to the cold case detective who took up the investigation, and he has kept it above his desk ever since. A small, constant reminder of how thin the line was between the intended target and the couple who actually died. For the detective, that mailbox is both a piece of the puzzle and a private vow to keep working it. Investigators note that it should have been obvious the home was occupied that night. The case was brought back into public view on its 40th anniversary in 2021, and again on its 44th in March of 2025. Each time with a reward of $30,000 offered for information. Detectives have said that as recently as 2025, they were able to recover DNA from evidence in the case, giving them something their predecessors never had. That same cold case unit has managed to close other decades-old killings in recent years, including one from the 1970s solved in 2024. And the family has held on to that as a reason to hope. Joseph and Betty's descendants, among them a daughter-in-law and a grandson who still carries the family name, have stayed publicly involved, appearing whenever the case resurfaces to remind the community that two people it once loved are still waiting for justice. Still, no one has ever been arrested, and the fire that took Joseph and Betty Selby remains, officially, unsolved. Joseph and Betty Selby died in the one place they should have been safest, asleep in their own beds. The last couple in this half of the story felt safest somewhere else entirely, out under an open Arizona sky, far from any house, on a night that was supposed to be a celebration. Brandon Rumbaugh and Lisa Gurrieri. In the autumn of 2003, a young couple drove north out of the Phoenix suburbs to spend a night camping under the stars, marking 1 year together by returning to the kind of place their relationship had begun. They were supposed to be home by the weekend. When they missed work and stopped answering their phones, their families went looking. And 2 days later, friends found their borrowed truck parked out in the desert with both of them inside it. Whoever did this then vanished into 90,000 acres of forest, and more than 20 years on, has never been found. Brandon Rumbaugh was 20 and worked as a fitness trainer in Mesa. Lisa Gurrieri was 19, held a job at a local utility, and played in her church band. They were a young couple celebrating 1 year of dating, and Lisa's mother would later say that Brandon treated her daughter like a queen. They had thought about a trip to Disneyland, but chose instead to recreate their very first date, a night of stargazing out in the open desert. On Friday, the 17th of October, they left Scottsdale in a white Ford pickup borrowed from Lisa's mother and drove toward the tiny, remote spot known as Bumblebee, off the interstate, roughly an hour north of Phoenix. They were expected back the next day. When Brandon did not turn up for work, the search began. And on Sunday the 19th, 3 family friends found the truck. The couple were in the bed of the pickup, still inside their sleeping bags. They had been settling in for the night they had planned, a quiet return to the place where their story had begun. Both had been shot multiple times. The medical examiner placed the deaths somewhere between Friday evening and early Saturday morning. That window meant the killer had a wide stretch of darkness to work in. Out in a place where there were no neighbors to hear anything and no cameras to record it, with the nearest help miles away, down empty desert roads. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office took the case and quickly ruled out the obvious explanations. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, and no sign of drugs or alcohol. The possibility that one of them had harmed the other and then themselves was ruled out as well. Everything about the couple pointed away from any explanation that started with them, which left investigators facing the hardest kind of case, a double killing with no clear reason and no obvious suspect. Among the evidence recovered at the scene was a disposable camera holding the last photographs the couple ever took, including one overexposed image believed to have been shot near a business in Bumblebee. Those pictures captured a happy couple on an ordinary night, with no hint of who might have been out there in the dark with them. An early person of interest cooperated fully with detectives and was cleared, leaving investigators with a scene full of evidence and no one to attach it to. The killer had left the couple's belongings behind and slipped away into terrain vast enough to swallow almost any trace. And then the trail simply stopped. Who follows a young couple into the desert on their anniversary, does something like this, and then melts away into 90,000 acres of national forest without leaving a name behind? Investigators have never settled on a motive. Lisa's mother wondered aloud whether jealousy might have played a part, but nothing has ever been proven. And beyond that, the motive remains as blank now as it was on the morning the truck was found. Detectives have said that plenty of people have drifted onto their radar over the years, though none has ever been confirmed. And they described the case as sitting in a kind of holding pattern, waiting for a tip or a forensic breakthrough that has not yet come. They are honest that they need a break they cannot manufacture, a name from a witness or a match from the evidence they have held all these years. For a time, investigators in California even wondered whether the killings might be tied to a separate double murder on a beach there. Until another man pleaded guilty to that crime and ruled the connection out. In the years since, the case has been revisited by local news programs and folded into wider coverage of a troubling string of unsolved killings at Arizona campsites, all of them sharing the same terrible shape. Ordinary people who drove out to enjoy the desert and never came home. A reward of $10,000 still stands for anyone who can help. And the couple's families have never stopped asking for it, keeping their names alive year after year in the hope that someone, somewhere, knows what happened on that road. As of 2026, the killing of Brandon Rumbaugh and Lisa Gurrieri remains unsolved. A young couple who drove into the desert to celebrate a year together and never drove back out. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Harvey and Jeanette Crew. In the winter of 1970, a young farming couple in a small New Zealand community vanished from their own home, leaving behind a scene that told investigators at once that something terrible had happened inside. Their baby daughter was found alone in her cot, unharmed. And it soon became clear that in the days after her parents were gone, someone had returned to the house to feed her. More than 50 years later, no one has ever been able to say for certain who was responsible for the couple's deaths, and the question of who cared for that child has never been answered. Harvey and Jeanette Crew were in their late 20s and early 30s, building a life together on a farm at Pukakawa, south of Auckland. Jeanette had inherited a share of the land from an uncle, and Harvey had bought out the rest to make it their own. They were, by every account, an ordinary rural couple, quietly working their land and raising their infant daughter. Nothing about their lives suggested they were headed for anything but a long and unremarkable future. On or around the 17th of June, 1970, the couple lost their lives inside their own farmhouse, and their bodies were taken from the property and placed into the Waikato River. For days, no one realized what had happened. It was not until the 22nd of June that Jeanette's father let himself into the house and found the couple gone and their baby daughter still in her cot. He called the police at once. Over the following weeks, the couple's bodies were recovered from the river. Jeanette's in August and Harvey's in September, each having been weighted down before being placed in the water. Both had been fatally shot. The investigation soon focused on a local farmer named Arthur Allen Thomas. In November of that year, he was arrested, and he would go on to be convicted twice, first in 1971 and again after a retrial in 1973. The case against him rested heavily on two pieces of evidence: a spent cartridge found at the farmhouse that was said to match his rifle, and a car part used to weigh down one of the bodies, which was traced back to a trailer once owned by his father. To the courts, it seemed conclusive. Thomas was sent to prison, and for most of the country the matter appeared settled. But a quiet question sat beneath that verdict, one the trial had never truly answered. Who had really been inside that farmhouse, and who had come back in the days that followed to keep a small child alive? The tidy version of events did not hold. Doubts about how that cartridge had come to be found refused to go away. And in 1980, a Royal Commission of Inquiry reached a stunning conclusion. It found that police had fabricated evidence and planted the cartridge case at the scene in order to secure a conviction against Thomas. The inquiry pointed to two detectives at the very heart of the original case, and its findings became a landmark in the nation's legal history, a lasting byword for how badly an investigation can go wrong. He had spent 9 years in prison for something the inquiry determined he did not do. In 1979, he was granted a free pardon, the only time in the country's history that the government stepped past the courts to release a man it had convicted, and he was later paid compensation for the years that had been taken from him. Attention turned to other possible suspects, among them members of the couple's own extended family, but no one else was ever charged. Thomas himself returned to a quiet life on the land, cleared at last but forever marked as the man the system had wrongly blamed. For 4 decades, the couple's daughter grew up in the shadow of the case, and in 2010, as an adult, she asked police to look at it once more. They declined to launch a fresh homicide inquiry, but agreed to a full review of the old files, which was completed in 2014. That review acknowledged the failings of the original investigation, formally apologized to her, and cleared her aunt and grandparents of any involvement once and for all. It pointed to avenues that had never been properly explored. Yet it could not put a name to the person responsible. As of 2026, the deaths of Harvey and Jeanette Crew remain officially unsolved, the most infamous cold case in New Zealand's history. A book published in 2023 brought fresh witness accounts to light and went on to win a major national award, keeping alive a mystery that has troubled the country for 2 generations. The Crew case left New Zealand with a lasting distrust of the very people who were supposed to find the truth. Nearly 20 years later, and half a world away, another couple would die in a way that looked practiced and deliberate. And their case too would come to be shadowed by claims that the authorities knew far more than they ever admitted. Terry Gooderham and Maxine Arnold. 2 days before Christmas in 1989, a couple in East London sat down to dinner in their flat, with the lights on and the fire lit. Then the phone rang, and within minutes they left everything behind. A half-eaten meal, her handbag, his wallet and watch, and drove off into the night without telling a soul where they were going. Hours later, their car was found deep in Epping Forest, with the engine still running, and both of them dead inside. More than 30 years on, no one has ever been charged, and there are those who believe the reason lies in what the authorities chose not to pursue. Terry Gooderham was 39 and worked as a stocktaker, keeping the books for pubs and wine bars across London. Maxine Arnold was 32 and worked in an insurance office, and the two had been together for around 7 years. Terry, it would later emerge, had been quietly living a double life, dividing his time between Maxine and at least one other woman. Maxine, by contrast, is remembered by nearly everyone as an innocent woman who happened to be at his side on the wrong night. On the evening of the 22nd of December, the couple were having dinner before a planned Christmas drink with Maxine's mother. At around 6:45, a work colleague phoned, and Maxine suddenly seemed hurried, telling Terry they had to be somewhere. They rushed out so quickly that they left the gas fire burning, the Christmas lights on, and her purse sitting behind them, and drove off in Terry's black Mercedes toward Epping Forest. Witnesses later described the car being driven erratically and flashing its lights in the early evening, as though something was already badly wrong. In the small hours of the following morning, a patrol car came upon the Mercedes, parked in a quiet lane, its engine still idling, and found that both Terry and Maxine had been shot. It was a secluded spot, the kind couples used for privacy, and the still-running engine was what first drew the officers to look closer. Why would two people abandon a warm dinner, leave the door as good as open behind them, and drive into the dark without a single word to anyone who loved them? Detectives came to believe the couple had not gone willingly, that they had been lured or forced to that spot and dealt with in a way that looked professional and rehearsed. One theory held that gunmen had been waiting in the back of the car, with a second vehicle following behind. Terry's tangled private life gave investigators no shortage of people to weigh, from jealous partners to business rivals, yet none of them was ever charged. As for why, the most carefully sourced explanation over the years has pointed not to money, but to silence. Moving through the city's pubs as a stock-taker, Terry was said to have stumbled onto a criminal operation, a racket involving protection payments and hijacked deliveries, and to have been on the verge of taking what he knew to the police. Killing him, the theory goes, was a way to keep him quiet. A separate and far shakier piece of underworld folklore claimed he had crossed a notorious London crime family by taking a sum of around £250,000, though no solid evidence has ever supported that story. In more recent years, a retired detective went public with claims from an old informant of his, a former enforcer who said, in the days after the killings, that a figure once connected to the old Cray firm had put up the money for the contract. Other men have been named in the press as the ones who supposedly carried it out. Yet not a single one of them has ever been charged, and the naming has always remained the work of journalists rather than the courts. The Metropolitan Police last formally reviewed the case in 2015 without being able to move it forward, and later reporting revived questions about whether intelligence identifying the suspects had been intercepted or quietly buried at the time. Around the 35th anniversary of the killings, two investigative journalists suggested a link between this case and an unidentified body found in the countryside a year later. Though that connection remains a theory and nothing more. For years, the file passed from one review to the next, each time raising hopes that quietly went nowhere. What is certain is that Maxine's mother went to her own grave without ever seeing anyone answer for her daughter's death. As of 2026, the killings in Epping Forest remain unsolved, trailed by the persistent and unproven suspicion that the truth was known and allowed to slip away. In the Gooderham case, the people said to be responsible were named in newspapers, yet never touched by the law. In a quiet Michigan township, another couple would die in their sleep, and there too the person investigators most suspected would go to his grave without ever being charged. Kenneth Cannell Jr. and Pamela Barnes. In the summer of 2005, a couple in a Michigan township who had recently moved in together were found in their bed, both having been shot as they slept. Nothing had been stolen, no door had been forced, and everything about the scene suggested they had let their killer walk right in. Police settled on a person of interest within a matter of days. But they could never build a case strong enough to charge him. And by the time this story reaches the present, that man has carried whatever he knew out of reach for good. Kenneth Cannell Jr. was in his late 30s, a Waterford man who worked as a technician troubleshooting vehicles for a company that served the auto industry. Pamela Barnes was a little older, a trained occupational therapist who worked at a rehabilitation center. The detail that everyone who knew them returns to is how completely both of them lived for their children, and how close Ken was in particular with his own daughter. The two of them often described as best friends. The couple had met the winter before and moved in together that spring, renting a home on a quiet residential street. The couple were last seen at a party on the 2nd of July. When Pamela failed to show up for work in the days that followed, her worried family reached out to the police, who went to the home and found them both around 5 in the afternoon on the 6th of July. Several days had passed between that party and the grim discovery, days in which friends and co-workers slowly began to sense that something was wrong. The couple had been building something new together, only months into living under the same roof, when it was cut short. They had been shot more than once as they slept. There was no sign of a break-in, and nothing of value had been taken, which told investigators almost immediately that this had not been a burglary or a random attack. The absence of any struggle or forced entry painted a chilling picture of two people who had felt safe enough to sleep while someone they had let inside moved through their home. The local police, working with county forensic specialists, concluded that the couple had very likely known the person who did this, and that they had been deliberately targeted. A person of interest emerged early. According to detailed reporting on the case, the main focus fell on the father of Pamela's younger daughter, a man who reportedly twice declined to take a polygraph. At the funeral home, he is said to have told Ken's daughter that everything would be all right now, that things would be better from here, a remark her family found deeply unsettling. Investigators kept working that angle for years, and in 2010 they executed a search warrant at a property in another Michigan town. That warrant raised hopes of a breakthrough, yet like every other lead in the case, it ended without an arrest. Police were candid that they had a suspect in mind almost from the start, but wanting to know who did something and being able to prove it in a courtroom are two very different things. If the couple had opened their own door to the person who did this, then who was close enough and angry enough to want them both gone? The family has never had much doubt about the shape of it. One of Ken's relatives described the killing as a crime of greed and jealousy, and most likely, rage. Ken, by some accounts, had been having second thoughts about the relationship, in part because of ongoing friction with the father of Pamela's daughter. But suspicion is not proof, and the man at the center of that suspicion was never publicly named by police, precisely because he was never charged. He has since died. As of 2026, the killings remain unsolved, with a modest reward still on offer through a local crime-fighting organization. The couple's children, who were young when they lost their parents, have long since grown up, and over the years the family has marked the grim anniversaries with public appeals, asking anyone who knows something to come forward while it still matters. Ken's stepmother has been among the most vocal, returning again and again to the same plea, that someone who knows the truth finally find the courage to share it. The reward has stayed modest across the years, a few $1,000s offered through a regional tip line, small against the size of what this family has lost. The person of interest never faced a courtroom, and his death closed off the one path that might ever have led to a confession. For the family in Michigan, the silence came from a grave, from a man who could no longer be made to answer. In South Los Angeles, the silence around another young couple's deaths came from something else entirely. From neighbors who saw what happened and were too frightened to say so. Brenda Aguilera and Jonathan Plasencia. On a spring night in 2008, a young couple sat talking in a parked car outside her family's home in South Los Angeles. A gunman walked up to the car and opened fire on both of them. And then, as he ran, he turned his weapon toward three young women sitting on a nearby porch. The couple did not survive. And although it happened in the open, in front of a family home, and within earshot of neighbors, the police have spent more than 15 years running into the same wall, a community that knows something and will not speak. Brenda Aguilera was 21 and had only just celebrated that birthday. Jonathan Plasencia was 20, and the two were young and in love. To the families they left behind, the most important thing to say about them is the simplest, that they were good people, whose lives mattered and who were deeply loved. They were sitting together that night in a car outside the Aguilera family's home, doing nothing more than talking. It was a Sunday, the 27th of April, at around 11:15 at night. At least one gunman approached the parked car and shot both Brenda and Jonathan. As he fled the scene, he fired toward three young women sitting on a porch nearby, wounding them, though none of those injuries proved life-threatening. Brenda was pronounced dead where she sat, and Jonathan died a short time later at a hospital. Neighbors would have heard the shots ring out across the quiet street, and some of them, the police came to believe, would have seen the face of the man who fired them. The only description witnesses could offer of the shooter was vague, and he was last seen leaving the area in a green van. It was so thin a description that it could have fit almost anyone, a man, a green van, and little else to hold on to. It was also the kind of attack that seemed almost designed to be seen, carried out on an open street where anyone might have been watching. The case went to the Los Angeles Police Department's robbery-homicide detectives, and from the beginning they were candid about the problem in front of them. There were people in that neighborhood who knew exactly what had happened, but for reasons of fear or something close to it, they would not come forward. No motive was ever officially established. The location and the method carried the hallmarks of a targeted attack, but investigators have never publicly committed to why the couple was chosen, or by whom. Detectives have long believed the answer is not truly out of reach, that it lives in the memory of people who were there or who heard within hours exactly what had happened. The obstacle has never been a lack of knowledge in that neighborhood. It has been the unwillingness or the fear that has kept anyone from carrying what they know to the police, and it has left the case defined less by what the detectives do not know than by what others will not tell them. How does a shooting unfold in front of a family home, in plain view of witnesses, and still leave detectives with no one willing to say what they saw? That question has defined the case for well over a decade. In an effort to break the silence, the city offered a reward of $75,000, first approved in 2015 and then renewed years later, when the couple's families gathered once more to plead publicly for help. One of Brenda's relatives spoke of having witnessed the terrible aftermath that night, a memory that no amount of time has softened. At that gathering, more than 17 years after the shooting, the grief in the family was as raw as it had ever been, sharpened by the knowledge that the answers might be sitting only a few doors away. Even so, the police have acknowledged that they have no new information to work with. The couple had their whole lives ahead of them. One of them only days past a birthday, when a stranger with a gun ended both in a matter of seconds. Each renewal of the reward is, in its own quiet way, an admission of how little has changed, and a refusal to let the case disappear. And the families have kept standing before cameras whenever it resurfaces to say the same simple thing: that two young people were loved, and that someone owes them the truth. As of 2026, the deaths of Brenda Aguilera and Jonathan Placencia remain unsolved, held in place not by a lack of witnesses, but by the fear that has kept those witnesses quiet. In Los Angeles, the case has never come close to a courtroom, stalling long before it could ever begin. The last story in this collection is almost the opposite. A case that went all the way to a conviction, then came apart so completely that the law now regards it as unsolved, even though a man once confessed to it. Vicky Durian and Nancy Santomero. In the summer of 1980, two young women set out hitchhiking toward a peaceful gathering in the mountains of West Virginia. The kind of festival built around music, harmony, and living gently on the land. They never arrived. Their bodies were found in a remote clearing, and what followed became one of the strangest journeys through the justice system that any unsolved case has ever taken. A conviction, a reversal, a confession from a serial killer. And in the end, no one held responsible at all. Vicky Durian was 26, a woman from Iowa who had been working as a home health aide out in Arizona. Nancy Santomero was 19, originally from New York, and had been getting by with a job at a thrift store in Tucson. The two were free-spirited and adventurous, making their way across the country toward a counterculture gathering deep in a national forest. A third friend had been traveling with them, but chose, at the last moment, not to go the rest of the way, a decision that would follow her for the rest of her life. On the 25th of June, 1980, the two women lost their lives in an isolated clearing at the edge of a mountain in Pocahontas County, a rural stretch of Appalachia. It was around 9 that evening when a passing college student came upon them. Both had been shot at close range, and neither had been sexually assaulted. In a tight-knit community where such a thing was almost unimaginable, the killings landed like a shockwave that would take decades to settle. How could a case like this end with a conviction, a confession, and a man put to death, and still, in the eyes of the law, remain unsolved? For 13 years, no one was prosecuted at all. Then, in 1992, charges were finally brought against a local farmer named Jacob Beard, along with several other local men. Those charges collapsed amid allegations that an officer had physically threatened a suspect before being refiled, with the state ultimately choosing to pursue Beard alone as the man who had pulled the trigger. The dragnet had swept up half a dozen local men before the state narrowed its focus, and the way it was handled left scars in the community that never fully healed. In 1993, after a trial moved to another county because of the intense publicity, Beard was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. But his lawyers had tried, and failed, to put something before that jury which would later change everything. The confession of a man named Joseph Paul Franklin. Franklin was a white supremacist and a serial killer, and back in 1984 he had told authorities that he had taken the lives of 2 women in West Virginia. At Beard's trial, the judge had ruled that confession too unreliable to admit. But in 1999, a court granted Beard a new hearing, based on a sworn deposition in which Franklin confessed again, together with fresh testimony supporting Beard's alibi. Beard was released while he awaited a second trial, and in the year 2000, a jury acquitted him outright. He would later sue over his wrongful conviction, and the county eventually settled with him for $2 million. For Beard, that vindication came only after he had already spent years behind bars for something a jury ultimately decided he had not done. As for Franklin, he confessed to the killings more than once, describing how he had picked the 2 women up as they hitchhiked and then decided to take their lives after one of them mentioned that she had a black boyfriend. Yet for all his confessions, he was never charged with these particular deaths. Some investigators doubted his account, and many locals had long believed the killer was one of their own. Whether Franklin truly took the 2 women's lives or simply claimed a crime that fit his long pattern of hatred is a question that died along with him. In 2013, Franklin was executed in Missouri for a separate, racially motivated murder, taking whatever certainty existed about the West Virginia case with him. And so the case rests in a strange and unresolved place. The only person ever convicted of the killings was cleared at a second trial. The only person who ever confessed was never tried and is now dead. There is no living suspect left to prosecute, and no official body has ever formally declared the matter solved. In the years since, the case has drawn renewed national attention through books and a planned documentary, revisiting not only the deaths themselves, but the deep wounds the investigation left behind. A community where neighbors had once accused neighbors, and where the search for justice caused nearly as much lasting pain as the crime itself. The people of Pocahontas County were left to go on living side by side with those accusations still hanging in the air. Neighbors who had once pointed fingers now sharing the same small towns. As of 2026, the killings of Vicky Durian and Nancy Santomero remain, in the eyes of the law, unsolved. Every couple in this collection left behind people who are still waiting for an answer, and in most of these cases, someone out there still knows the truth. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.